It was the most polite dismissal in the history of the Vietnam War. In early 1966, a senior American military advisor stood inside a briefing tent at Nui Dat, freshly erected in a rubber plantation that still smelled of latex sap and freshly turned earth. He had come to deliver what he considered a courtesy, a standing offer of American supervision for the newly arrived Australians. He carried a stack of operational directives from MACV headquarters, protocol documents for integrating Allied forces under American command structures, radio frequency assignments, fire support coordination procedures, and a proposed schedule of American advisory visits to monitor Australian operational readiness. He placed the documents on the table with the confidence of a man representing the most powerful military on Earth. The Australian brigadier across the table listened in silence. He did not touch the documents. He did not open a single folder. When the American finished speaking, the brigadier looked him in the eye and said 7 words that would define Australia's entire war in Vietnam. "We don't need babysitters. We need ammunition." The American advisor left that tent with every document still in his hands. He would spend the next 5 years watching the Australians prove, in blood and fire, exactly why they didn't need minding. But to understand what made those words so audacious and what made the Australians so certain they could back them up, you have to understand the war the way it looked from Canberra, not Washington. You have to understand the century of hard-won jungle knowledge that those men carried with them into Phuoc Tuy province, and you have to understand what happened when the enemy tested their confidence at a place called Long Tan, at firebases called Coral and Balmoral, and in 100 unnamed ambush sites along trails the Americans had already declared too dangerous for their own Marines. The roots of Australian independence in Vietnam did not begin in 1966. They began in 1948 in the dripping rainforests of the Malay Peninsula, where Australian soldiers learned a form of warfare that the American military had never been forced to master. The Malayan Emergency was a 12-year counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas hiding in some of the densest jungle on Earth. The British Empire was crumbling. Resources were scarce. There were no B-52 bombers to call upon, no helicopter gunships circling overhead, no endless supply chains stretching back to factories in Michigan and Ohio. What the Australians had was patience, fieldcraft, and an understanding that in the jungle the quiet man survives and the loud man dies. During those years in Malayan, Australian soldiers learned to track human beings through terrain so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. They learned to set ambushes that lasted days, lying motionless in mud while leeches burrowed into their skin and mosquitoes clouded around their faces. They learned to read the jungle the way a literate man reads a book, noticing bent stems, scuff marks on bark, the absence of spider webs across a trail that should have had them. They learned that a broken cobweb at knee height meant someone had passed through in the last few hours. They learned that birds falling silent in a single sector of canopy meant something was moving below that the birds did not like. Most critically, they learned that a counterinsurgency is not won by destroying the enemy's army. It is won by separating the enemy from the people who feed him, shelter him, and give him information. The rubber tappers who left food at the jungle's edge, the village headmen who warned of army patrols, the supply networks that kept guerrilla camps fed and armed. Sever those connections the Australians discovered, and the guerrilla withers. He does not need to be hunted down and killed. He simply starves, both of supplies and of intelligence, until he either surrenders or makes a mistake that gets him killed. The Malayan approach required patience that bordered on the pathological. Operations lasted weeks, not hours. Success was measured not in bodies counted, but in contacts denied, supply routes disrupted, and civilian populations gradually brought under government protection. It was warfare that looked nothing like the industrial killing fields of Europe or the Pacific that had defined the previous generation's experience of combat. It was quiet, grinding, deeply personal, and spectacularly effective. The communist insurgency in Malaya was defeated, not contained, not negotiated into stalemate, defeated. These lessons were branded into the institutional memory of the Australian Army with the permanence of scar tissue. Every officer who would later command troops in Vietnam had either served in Malaya himself or been trained by men who had. The lessons were passed down in training manuals, in officer courses, in the stories told over beers, in the mess halls of barracks from Sydney to Perth. Malaya was not ancient history for the Australians going to Vietnam. It was living memory, and the men who carried those memories were still serving. When the Americans began their build-up in Vietnam in the early 1960s, they turned to Australia, and the reason was painfully simple. The United States Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, openly admitted at the ANZUS meeting in Canberra in May 1962 that American armed forces knew very little about jungle warfare. The Australians, fresh from their success in Malaya and later operations during the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo, were considered among the world's foremost experts. It was an extraordinary admission from the leader of the free world's diplomatic corps. America was preparing to fight a jungle war, and its own Secretary of State was conceding that his country's soldiers did not know how. Australia's first contribution was the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, designated the AATTV, though the men who served in it simply called themselves the Team. Raised in 1962, the AATTV initially consisted of just 30 officers and warrant officers, hand-selected from the infantry, the SAS, and the commandos. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were career professionals with an average age of 35, men who had spent their adult lives mastering the art of small wars in difficult terrain. Their commander was Colonel Ted Sarong, a counterinsurgency specialist whose reputation preceded him across Southeast Asia. The team was dispatched across the length and breadth of South Vietnam, embedded with South Vietnamese units and American advisory groups, training local forces in the jungle warfare techniques that had proven so effective in Malaya. They taught patrolling, ambush drills, tracking, and the kind of immediate action contact drills that allowed a small unit to react automatically when the jungle erupted in gunfire. For many of these Australians, service with the AATTV was an isolating experience. They worked alone or in pairs, often the only Australians for hundreds of kilometers, sleeping in remote outposts and walking point with Vietnamese soldiers whose language they were still learning. But it was during these early years, scattered across provinces from the Mekong Delta to the demilitarized zone, that the Australians began to see something that troubled them deeply. The American approach to the war was fundamentally different from everything they had learned. Where the Australians emphasized patience, the Americans emphasized speed. Where the Australians stressed small units moving quietly through the bush, the Americans deployed battalions by helicopter with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. Where the Australians believed in separating the guerrilla from the population Through careful, sustained engagement with local communities, the Americans measured progress in body counts and territory swept. The AATTV members watched American operations with professional dismay. They saw battalions inserted by helicopter into landing zones that the enemy had been watching for hours. They saw artillery preparation that announced an attack so thoroughly that any competent guerrilla commander had ample time to withdraw his forces before the first American boot touched the ground. They saw patrols that moved so quickly through the bush that they might as well have been ringing dinner bells for every Viet Cong ambush team within earshot. They saw search and destroy operations that destroyed a great deal and found very little because the enemy had long since departed by the time the searchers arrived. The relationships between AATTV advisors and their American counterparts were generally cordial on a personal level. Australian warrant officers and American sergeants shared the universal bond of professional soldiers doing a dangerous job far from home. But there were sometimes significant differences of opinion on the training and tactics that should be employed with Vietnamese forces. The Australians would teach a Vietnamese unit to patrol slowly, set careful ambushes, and avoid contact unless the terms were favorable. Then an American advisor would arrive and push the same unit into a large-scale sweep operation that undid weeks of patient instruction. The differences were not merely tactical, they were philosophical, and the Australian military establishment in Canberra became increasingly convinced that if Australian soldiers were going to fight and die in Vietnam, they needed to do it their way, not the American way. By 1966, the decision had been made. Australia would dramatically escalate its commitment, deploying the 1st Australian Task Force, a brigade-sized formation of approximately 4,500 troops, with infantry battalions, armored personnel carriers, artillery, engineers, and aviation support. It was the largest Australian military deployment since the Second World War, and it would operate independently. The negotiations that secured this independence were delicate and deliberate. Lieutenant General John Wilton, the chairman of the Australian Chiefs of Staff Committee, engaged directly with General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam. The arrangement was carefully structured. The 1st Australian Task Force would fall under the operational control of the American 2nd Field Force Vietnam, a corps-level headquarters at Bien Hoa. But it would retain its own command structure, its own tactical doctrine, and its own area of operations. The Australians selected Phuoc Tuy Province, a coastal region southeast of Saigon that was home to significant Viet Cong activity, could be resupplied by sea through the port of Vung Tau, and was sufficiently removed from the Cambodian border to avoid the kind of large-scale conventional battles that American forces were fighting further north and west. The choice of base location revealed the Australian mindset from the outset. Wilton selected Nui Dat, a small hill in the center of the province, because its position would allow the Australians to insert themselves directly between the Viet Cong and the local population. Australian doctrine emphasized establishing a base and radiating influence outward, gradually extending government authority by making it impossible for the guerrillas to move freely among the people. This was the Malayan model, transplanted to Vietnamese soil. The establishment of Nui Dat in May 1966 was itself a statement of intent. The Americans provided the initial security for the operation, with the 173rd Airborne Brigade sweeping the surrounding countryside before the Australians moved in. During that sweep, the American paratroopers encountered significant Viet Cong resistance. One American company was badly mauled on the first day, losing 8 killed and 23 wounded in a box ambush on the western slope of a nearby hill. The enemy was present, aggressive, and dangerous. Australians were moving into hostile territory. Once established, the Australians removed all inhabitants within a 4-kilometer radius, an unusual and controversial step that no American base had attempted on this scale. The villages of Long Tan, with a population of roughly 1,000, and Long Phuoc, home to about 3,000 people, were forcibly resettled. It was a hard decision that generated resentment among the displaced population and complicated Australian efforts to win local support. But the reasoning was pure counterinsurgency. With no civilians nearby, the Viet Cong could not observe the base, could not gather intelligence on troop movements, and could not position mortars within effective range without entering a free-fire zone. It was also a declaration: this ground belongs to us now. We will control who enters and who leaves. We will operate on our terms. The base itself reflected Australian austerity, where American installations featured concrete bunkers, air-conditioned command centers, officers' clubs, and the elaborate infrastructure of a military that believed comfort was essential to morale. Nui Dat was a canvas and sandbag affair in a rubber plantation. Soldiers lived in tents. The defenses were dug by hand. The perimeter was wired and mined by Australian engineers who understood that every meter of wire they laid might be the meter that stopped a Viet Cong assault. No indigenous Vietnamese were allowed inside the base, a security measure that ensured the Viet Cong could not infiltrate agents among the workers, cooks, and laborers who populated American bases throughout Vietnam. It meant the Australians did their own cleaning, their own laundry, their own menial work. It also meant they controlled their own security completely. American advisors were not part of the plan. The 1st Australian Task Force would have American artillery support, specifically 6 155mm self-propelled howitzers from a battery of the American 2nd Battalion, 35th. Artillery, permanently stationed at Nui Dat. American helicopters would provide transport and medevac when needed. American close-air support could be called in emergencies, but the Australians would plan their own operations, run their own intelligence, command their own soldiers, and fight their own war. This arrangement did not sit well with everyone in Saigon. Westmoreland, who believed in the aggressive application of overwhelming firepower, grew frustrated with what he perceived as the Australians' cautious approach. In early 1967, he formally complained to Major General Tim Vincent, the commander of Australian Forces Vietnam, demanding a more aggressive posture. The Australians were convinced that their deliberate patrolling techniques were more effective at separating the guerrillas from the population than the large-scale search-and-destroy operations the Americans favored. Westmoreland's urgings went largely unheeded. The Australians had not crossed an ocean to fight someone else's war someone else's way. The vindication of this approach came with sudden, brutal violence on the afternoon of August 18, 1966, barely 2 months after the base at Nui Dat was established. Delta Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, numbering just 108 men accompanied by 3 New Zealand artillery forward observers, was patrolling through a rubber plantation near the village of Long Tan, roughly 4 kilometers east of the base. They were following up on a Viet Cong mortar attack that had struck Nui Dat the previous night. What Delta Company did not know was that they were walking toward the bulk of the Viet Cong 275th Main Force Regiment and the D445 Provincial Battalion. Estimates would later place the enemy force at over 2,000 soldiers. The Australians were outnumbered by more than 10 to 1. The first contact came when 11 platoon, advancing on the right flank, ran into a small group of Viet Cong. A brief firefight sent the enemy fleeing east. Lieutenant Gordon Sharp pursued with his platoon, and then the jungle erupted. The small group had been a screening element. Behind them was the main force, and it was advancing directly into Delta Company's path. Within minutes, 11 platoon was engulfed. Enemy fire came from 3 sides. Soldiers fell in the opening seconds. Sharp was among those killed. The platoon was being annihilated. Major Harry Smith, commanding Delta Company, pulled his remaining platoons into a defensive perimeter around the company headquarters, but the position was desperate. Monsoon rain hammered the plantation, reducing visibility to meters. The noise of the downpour mingled with the sustained crack of automatic weapons and the detonation of rocket-propelled grenades in a wall of sound that made communication nearly impossible. What saved Delta Company was not American intervention. It was Australian artillery. 3 batteries of the Royal Australian Artillery at Nui Dat, supplemented by the New Zealand 161st Battery, began pouring fire into the plantation with a precision that was devastating in its accuracy. The New Zealand forward observer, Captain Maury Stanley, called rounds so close to the Australian perimeter that the blast concussions physically shook the soldiers in their positions. At times, the shells were landing within 25 meters of the Australians. It was a demonstration of the kind of trust between infantry and artillery that only develops when both have trained together, operated together, and understand each other completely. For nearly 4 hours, Delta Company held. The Viet Cong launched human wave assaults against the perimeter. Each time, Australian rifle fire and artillery broke them apart. Ammunition ran critically low. Huey helicopters from the RAAF's 9 Squadron made desperate resupply runs, kicking crates of loose ammunition out of hovering aircraft into the rain-soaked plantation below. The soldiers tore open the boxes and loaded magazines by hand, while the enemy pressed in around them. A relief force of armored personnel carriers carrying Alpha Company raced from Nui Dat through swollen creeks and along trails that might have been ambushed. They arrived at the plantation's edge as the Viet Cong were massing for what might have been the final assault. The APCs crashed into the enemy flank with their heavy machine guns blazing. The Viet Cong broke. They withdrew into the jungle, leaving at least 245 confirmed dead on the field. The actual number was almost certainly much higher, as the enemy dragged many of their casualties away during the retreat. Delta Company had lost 18 killed and 25 wounded. More than a third of the company were casualties. It was the bloodiest single engagement of the war for Australian forces, but 108 men had faced 2,000 and survived. They had done it with their own artillery, their own APCs, their own helicopters, and their own doctrine. No American advisor had directed the battle. No American commander had approved the rapid fire missions. No American unit had ridden to the rescue. The aftermath of Long Tan hardened Australian resolve. If there had been any lingering doubt in Canberra about the wisdom of independent operations, the rubber plantation had settled it. The Australians could fight their war their way, and they could win. The years that followed saw the first Australian task force settle into Phuoc Tuy province with the grinding persistence of men who understood that counterinsurgency was not a sprint, but a marathon. While American operations in other provinces surged and receded with political tides in Washington, the Australians maintained a steady, unrelenting pressure on the Viet Cong infrastructure in their area. Their methods would have seemed painfully slow to an American observer. Australian patrols moved through the jungle at speeds that defied American comprehension. Where American reconnaissance units covered 2 to 3 kilometers per day, Australian SAS patrols advanced at rates closer to 100 meters per hour, sometimes less. Each step was deliberate. Each pause lasted minutes. The point man would freeze, scan, listen, breathe, and then take another step. Behind him, the patrol would replicate the movement with the choreographed precision of men who had rehearsed until the discipline lived in their muscles rather than their conscious minds. Communication within the patrol was conducted entirely by touch. A hand on the shoulder meant stop. A tap on the arm indicated direction. The signals were so subtle that an observer standing 5 meters away might miss them entirely. No one spoke. No one whispered. The only sounds the patrol generated were the sounds of the jungle itself, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the drip of moisture from the canopy, the distant call of a bird that did not know men were passing beneath its roost. Before every patrol, the Australians eliminated every trace of their Western identity. They stopped using soap, deodorant, and toothpaste weeks in advance. They ate local food. Some chewed betel nut. Their clothing was washed in unscented water and hung in the bush to absorb the smell of vegetation and decay. By insertion day, they smelled like the jungle itself. The scent discipline was not vanity or eccentricity. It was survival. Captured Viet Cong had confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be detected by smell from hundreds of meters away. The chemical signatures of Western hygiene products were completely alien to the jungle environment and hung in the humid air like a beacon. The Australians had eliminated that beacon entirely. The logic was merciless. At that speed, producing no scent, you created no signature at all. No snapped twigs, no rustled leaves, no vibrations traveling through root systems, no chemical trails in the humid air. The jungle's ambient soundscape remained intact. The jungle's ambient soundscape remained intact. Birds kept singing. Insects kept buzzing. To a Viet Cong listening post, an area where Australians were operating sounded exactly like an area where nothing was happening. But the slowness provided more than concealment. It transformed the Australians from targets into hunters. Moving at 100 meters per hour, they heard everything. Every bird call that stopped, every insect drone that shifted, every faint crack of a twig 200 meters away that meant another human being was moving through the bush. They detected the enemy long before the enemy detected them. They chose when to strike and when to let the enemy pass. They held the initiative at almost every moment. The ambushes that resulted from this methodology were clinically efficient. Small patrols of 5 men would position themselves along known Viet Cong trails and wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. When the enemy appeared, the engagement lasted seconds. Claymore mines detonated at point-blank range. Automatic weapons fire swept the killing zone, and then silence. The Australians would collect intelligence from the dead, note the positions for later analysis, and melt back into the jungle before any Viet Cong reaction force could respond. The psychological effect on the enemy was cumulative and devastating. Captured documents from D 445 Battalion, the Australians' primary opponent in Vuoc Thai, revealed a force that was increasingly reluctant to operate in areas where Australian patrols had been reported. Soldiers refused night assignments. Morale deteriorated. The Viet Cong gave the Australians a name that carried overtones of the supernatural: Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, phantoms of the forest. It was not a compliment born of grudging respect. It was an expression of genuine dread. But the true test of Australian independence came in May 1968, when the war changed shape entirely. The Tet Offensive had shattered American assumptions about the war's trajectory. Communist forces had struck across South Vietnam in a coordinated campaign of unprecedented scale. The initial assault had been blunted, but a second wave was building, and intelligence indicated that enemy forces were regrouping along infiltration routes leading to Saigon and the massive American base complex at Bien Hoa and Long Binh. The 1st Australian Task Force was ordered out of Phuoc Tuy for the first time, deployed north to establish fire support bases astride the enemy's approach routes. It was a mission that would push the Australians into a type of fighting they had not experienced since the Second World War. Not counterinsurgency, not ambush warfare, but the defense of fixed positions against regimental strength conventional assaults. Fire Support Base Coral was established on May 12, 1968, roughly 7 kilometers north of the town of Tan Uyên. The position sat directly across a major North Vietnamese infiltration corridor. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, along with elements of the 12th Field Regiment and the New Zealand 161st Battery, began setting up the firebase in an area of rubber plantation and scrubland. The deployment was rushed. Units were being inserted by helicopter throughout the day. By nightfall, the perimeter was incomplete. The fields of fire were not cleared, and the artillery positions were still being prepared when the first sentries began reporting movement in the tree line. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, on May 13th, the North Vietnamese opened with a barrage of rockets and mortars that shattered the pre-dawn stillness and sent fragments screaming through the Australian positions. Then came the ground assault. An entire North Vietnamese battalion emerged from the rubber trees at a run, pouring through gaps in the unfinished wire, overrunning positions before their defenders could organize a coherent response. The fighting at Coral that first night was among the most desperate the Australian Army had experienced since Tobruk and Kokoda in the Second World War. North Vietnamese soldiers reached the gun lines. They overran one of 102 battery's howitzers. Sergeant Max Franklin, the gun sergeant, had the presence of mind to rip out the firing mechanism, rendering the weapon useless to the enemy before his crew was forced to abandon the position. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the darkness. Australian gunners fired their howitzers at point-blank range into the advancing enemy, canister rounds shredding the night at ranges measured in meters rather than kilometers. The guns were being used not as artillery, but as giant shotguns, their crews fighting for their lives amid the smoke and chaos of a base under assault. The New Zealand 161st Battery, positioned a short distance from the main Australian position, poured supporting fire into the attacking force. Helicopter gunships arrived and strafed the tree line. American aircraft added their weight to the defense, but the decisive factor was the Australian soldiers themselves, men who refused to break even when the enemy was inside their wire, who fought from their weapon pits with rifles, machine guns, grenades, and bare fists, until the momentum of the assault was broken and the North Vietnamese began to fall back, leaving their dead draped across the sandbags. 9 Australians were killed and 28 wounded in that first attack, but the line held. Bombardier Andrew Forsdyke would later write of the experience with the raw honesty of a man who had stared into the void and survived. The ammunition was low, the grenades were gone, the enemy was all around, and there was nothing anyone could do except keep fighting and hope that the man next to you was doing the same. 3 days later, the enemy came again. A second assault struck Coral on May 16th, this time directed primarily at the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, which had moved into a nearby position designated Coogee. And 3 days after that, when the Australians established fire support base Balmoral 4.5 kilometers further north on May 24th, the North Vietnamese obliged by attacking it as well. They hit Balmoral twice, on May 26th and May 28th. The commander of the 3rd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Shelton, had learned from the mistakes made during the initial occupation of Coral. He sent infantry companies forward on foot to secure the position before the rest of the battalion was flown in, ensuring that the defenses were in place before the first helicopter touched down. Centurion tanks from C Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, were moved to Balmoral to bolster the firepower available to the defenders. Their 84mm guns and coaxial machine guns representing a weight of metal that no infantry assault could easily overcome. The second assault on Balmoral, on May 28th, was a full regimental effort. The North Vietnamese came through the wire in the darkness, pressing an attack along the northern perimeter across open ground that offered them no cover and no concealment. The Australian defenders met them with a wall of coordinated fire. Artillery from both Australian and New Zealand batteries rained down on the approaches. Mortars walked their bombs across the assembly areas where the next wave was forming. Machine guns swept the wire in interlocking arcs of fire, and the Centurion tanks, their turrets traversing methodically, fired round after round into the attacking mass with the deliberate precision of machines that felt neither fear nor fatigue. The attackers died in rows. It was brave, and it was hopeless. When patrols swept the area at dawn, they found 42 bodies in front of the wire, and drag marks indicating many more had been carried away under the cover of darkness. 7 prisoners were taken. Many of the dead were teenagers. The North Vietnamese had begun drafting 15-year-old boys into their combat formations, a grim indicator of the casualties the war was inflicting on their manpower reserves. Over the course of 4 weeks at Coral and Balmoral, the Australians accounted for over 300 confirmed enemy dead. 26 Australians were killed and more than 100 wounded. It was the most sustained and intense fighting Australian forces had experienced since the Second World War. And once again, it was an Australian battle, fought under Australian command, with Australian plans, Australian artillery, and Australian courage. No American officer directed the defense of Coral. No American advisor approved the fire missions that shattered the enemy assaults. The American contribution was logistical and supportive, exactly the relationship the Australians had insisted upon from the beginning. Helicopters, heavy artillery augmentation, air support when requested. The fighting, the dying, and the winning belonged to the Australians and their New Zealand comrades. The significance of Coral Balmoral extended beyond the tactical. It demonstrated that Australian independence was not merely a peacetime political arrangement that would collapse under the pressure of serious combat. The Australians had faced a conventional enemy in regimental strength, in prepared defensive positions under sustained assault, and they had held without American command intervention. The system worked. The doctrine held. The men proved worthy of the trust their government had placed in them. Westmoreland's concerns about Australian aggressiveness had been answered, though not in the way he had imagined. The Australians were perfectly willing to fight hard when the situation demanded it. They simply refused to fight stupidly when it did not. The tension between American and Australian methods was never fully resolved during the war. It was a tension rooted in fundamentally different military cultures. The American military of the 1960s was an institution shaped by the industrial warfare of the Second World War and the frozen battlefields of Korea. Its instincts were toward mass, firepower, and technological superiority. When a problem presented itself, the American answer was to apply more resources, more troops, more bombs, more helicopters, more of everything, until the problem was overwhelmed. The Australian military was an institution shaped by the small wars of the British Empire's twilight. Malaya, Borneo, the guerrilla campaigns of the Pacific Islands during the Second World War, where Australian soldiers had fought Japanese forces in terrain as demanding as anything Vietnam could offer. The Australian answer to a problem was not more resources. It was better application of the resources you already had. Smarter movement, more patient observation, deeper understanding of the human terrain in which the war was actually being fought. These were not just different tactical approaches, they were different philosophies about the relationship between a military force and the environment in which it operates. The Americans sought to dominate the environment through technology and firepower. The Australians sought to integrate with the environment so completely that they became indistinguishable from it. The Americans built enormous bases with air conditioning, ice cream parlors, and PX stores. The Australians built Nui Dat, a bare-bones compound in a rubber plantation where soldiers slept in tents, and the nearest luxury was a warm beer at the end of the day. The consequences of these different approaches showed in the statistics, though the statistics were distributed across thousands of individual engagements rather than concentrated in a single dramatic comparison. Australian forces in Phuoc Tuoi recorded at least 3,370 confirmed Viet Cong killed between 1966 and 1971. Total Australian Army casualties during the entire Vietnam War were 478 killed and 3,025 wounded. These numbers reflected a force that engaged the enemy on its own terms, at times and places of its own choosing, with tactics designed to minimize friendly casualties while maximizing enemy losses. The Australians were not invulnerable. They suffered setbacks and losses. The Battle of Soi Chau Pa in August 1967 was a bruising encounter where Alpha Company of the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, stumbled into a reinforced Viet Cong company in dense jungle during a monsoon downpour. The fighting was close, confused, and savage. The Australians suffered significant casualties before artillery tipped the balance. Operations in the Long Hai Mountains, a Viet Cong stronghold riddled with caves and tunnel complexes, proved consistently costly. The barrier minefield established in southern Phuoc Tui in 1967, an ambitious attempt to replicate a Malayan-era tactic, became a source of ongoing casualties when the Viet Cong began lifting the mines and relaying them against Australian patrols. These failures were instructive. They demonstrated that the Australian approach was not a magic formula, but a methodology that worked best when applied with discipline, and worst when it was compromised by haste, overconfidence, or attempts to impose. Solutions from a different war onto Vietnamese realities. The minefield, in particular, was a lesson in the dangers of transplanting tactics too literally from one campaign to another. What had worked in Malaya against a different enemy, in different terrain, did not necessarily work in Phuoc Tuy. But the broader pattern held. Australian forces achieved a degree of control in Phuoc Tuy province that was remarkable given the size of their force and the strength of the enemy they faced. By 1970, the province was arguably the most pacified in all of South Vietnam. Highway 15, the main route through Phuoc Tuy between Saigon and the port of Vung Tau, was open to unescorted civilian traffic, a claim that few other provinces could make. The Viet Cong's ability to coerce the local population had been severely degraded. Government authority, fragile as it was, extended further in Phuoc Tuy than in most comparable areas. This success was achieved by a force that peaked at roughly 8,000 personnel, including support elements, in a province that American doctrine would have assigned to a full division of 20,000 or more. The Australians accomplished with a brigade what the Americans would have attempted with 3 times the manpower, and they did it while sustaining a fraction of the casualties. The withdrawal of Australian forces beginning in 1970 and culminating in late 1971 brought its own bitter lessons. The province that the Australians had spent 5 years securing began reverting to Viet Cong influence almost immediately after they left. The South Vietnamese forces that took over Nui Dat lacked the training, the doctrine, and the institutional commitment to sustain the pressure that the Australians had maintained. Within months, the gains of half a decade were eroding. It was a preview of the larger collapse that would consume South Vietnam entirely in 1975. The AATTV, the original team that had started it all in 1962, was the last Australian unit to leave Vietnam. Its final members departed on December 18, 1972, more than 10 years after the first 30 advisors had arrived. Over that decade, 989 men served with the team. 33 were killed. 122 were wounded. 4 were awarded the Victoria Cross, Australia's highest military honor. The AATTV remains the most decorated Australian unit to serve in Vietnam, a testament to the extraordinary caliber of the men who fought alone or in pairs in some of the war's most dangerous assignments. The legacy of Australian independence in Vietnam is complicated. The tactical success was real and measurable. The Australians demonstrated that a well-trained force using counterinsurgency principles adapted from the Malayan emergency could achieve results in Vietnam that larger, better-resourced American formations could not match. They proved that independence of command was not merely a matter of national pride, but a tactical necessity that forces allowed to fight according to their own doctrine and their own experience performed better than forces compelled to conform to someone else's operational template. But the strategic failure was equally real. Phuoc Tuy province did not stay pacified. South Vietnam did not survive. The war was lost, and all the Australian skill and sacrifice in one coastal province could not change the outcome of a conflict whose dynamics were determined at scales far beyond the reach of a single brigade. The Australians won their battles and lost the war, not through any failing of their own, but because the war itself was unwinnable on the terms that any of the Allied nations had set. The men who served in Vietnam paid prices that extended far beyond the battlefield. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans were severe, and in some measures exceeded those of their American counterparts, despite smaller numbers and fewer casualties. The psychological cost of the kind of warfare the Australians practiced, the hypervigilance required for months of silent patrolling, the suppression of normal human response needed to remain invisible in enemy territory, the intimate violence of close-range jungle ambushes left marks that did not fade with demobilization. They came home to a country that did not want to hear about what they had done. The anti-war movement in Australia was intense and deeply divisive. Demonstrators had marched through the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. Conscription for the Vietnam War had been politically explosive, and the returning soldiers became lightning rods for public anger that was really directed at the politicians who had sent them. Some veterans were spat on. Others were told to remove their uniforms before entering certain establishments. Many learned quickly that the safest course was silence, to tuck the medals into a drawer and never mention where they had been or what they had done. The Australian government's treatment of its Vietnam veterans in the decades after the war compounded the personal cost. Recognition was slow. Medical support for physical and psychological injuries was inadequate. The effects of Agent Orange, which had been sprayed liberally across Phuoc Tuy province, would not be officially acknowledged for years. Veterans who suffered cancers, nerve damage, and birth defects in their children fought bureaucratic battles that lasted longer than their tours of duty. Many never spoke about their service. Many struggled for decades with memories that civilian society could not accommodate. The transformation that made them effective soldiers made them strangers in their own communities. The Special Air Service veterans carried particular burdens. Men who had spent weeks at a time in the jungle operating in 5-man patrols deep inside enemy territory, existing in a state of hypervigilance so total that their nervous systems remained locked in survival mode long after the danger had passed. Sleep was difficult. Crowds were unbearable. Sudden noises triggered responses that were appropriate in the jungle but terrifying in a suburban supermarket. The skills that had kept them alive, the ability to read a room for threats, the instinct to identify exits and cover, the constant scanning of faces for hostile intent, became curses in the peaceful world they had fought to protect. It would take Australia decades to acknowledge what its Vietnam veterans had accomplished. The formal apology from Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in 2023, stating that the nation should have recognized them better and sooner, came more than 50 years after the last soldier left Nui Dat. For many veterans, it came too late. But the professional legacy endures. The principles that Australian forces demonstrated in Vietnam, the emphasis on small unit excellence, the integration of indigenous knowledge, the patience of the hunter applied to the battlefield, the willingness to adapt equipment and doctrine to the actual environment, rather than the theoretical one, became foundational concepts in modern special operations doctrine worldwide. When the American military finally reformed its special operations capabilities in the 1980s with the creation of units like Delta Force and the expansion of the SEAL teams, the reforms incorporated lessons that Australian soldiers had demonstrated effective 2 decades earlier. The brigadier who told the American advisor that he did not need babysitters was not being arrogant. He was being accurate. He was speaking for an army that had spent a century learning how to fight in difficult terrain against elusive enemies with limited resources. He was speaking for men who had earned their knowledge in Malaya, in Borneo, and in the Pacific Islands at costs measured in blood rather than budget allocations. He was speaking for a military tradition that valued competence over spectacle, results over resources, and the quiet professional over the noisy amateur. The Americans who stood at Nui Dat with their advisory documents and coordination procedures were not wrong to offer. They were doing what their system required, but the Australian system required something different. It required the freedom to fight as Australians, to patrol at Australian speeds, to set Australian ambushes, to maintain Australian discipline in the field, to accept Australian casualties in pursuit of Australian objectives, and to answer when the Viet Cong came screaming out of the darkness at 3 a.m. with Australian fire. We don't need babysitters, we need ammunition. 7 words. Behind them, a century of jungle warfare. Ahead of them, 5 years that proved every syllable true. Total Australian Army casualties in the Vietnam War stood at 478 killed and over 3,000 wounded. They fought in a single province with a brigade where American doctrine would have demanded a division. They achieved a kill ratio that made American commanders ask uncomfortable questions. They earned the fear of an enemy that feared no one else, and they did it all on their own terms, under their own command, with their own doctrine, proving that in the jungle the quiet professionals are the most dangerous of all. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The Pentagon called their methods unconventional. The soldiers who served beside them called them something else entirely. They called them the best in the bush, and the bush, in the end, was where the war was won or lost, not in Saigon, not in Washington, not in the briefing tents where advisers offered supervision to men who did not need it. In the bush, in the dark, in the silence between one careful footstep and the next. That is where the Australians lived. That is where they fought. That is where they earned the right to say, with the calm certainty of men who knew exactly what they were capable of, "We don't need babysitters."